The wreckage of the massive Airship Italia's cabin lay strewn across the frozen tundra, along with 9 men from its crew, some in critical condition. Meanwhile, the aircraft's balloon component, loosed from the cabin by the impact of the crash, drifted away in the violent Arctic wind, with several crew members still aboard. The airship's captain, the Italian pilot and General Umberto Nobile, lay helpless on the large ice pack, having just moments before watched the crash through a porthole window in the Italia's cabin. His arm and leg were broken, and he felt a tightness in his chest, assuming he was done for. The other survivors who were healthy enough to walk scavenged the crash site for supplies, and miraculously located 2 pre-packed survival kits and the small wireless transmitter they had brought along in case they needed to broadcast a distress signal back to Norway, where they had launched from. Using the materials they recovered, food, tents, weapons, and warm clothes, the survivors from the ship's cabin set up a small camp and hunkered down to rest and prepare for the long haul on the drifting ice pack as they waited for rescue from their doomed attempt to reach the North Pole. Having been the first to conquer the South Pole in 1911, the famed Norwegian Roald Amundsen shifted his attention to the air as the next big advancement in polar exploration. He purchased a biplane in 1914 and became Norway's first ever licensed civilian pilot, with the belief that an aircraft would allow exploration of areas of the Arctic previously unreachable with ships and dog sleds. Searching for larger and more specialized planes, Amundsen turned to the American Lincoln Ellsworth in 1924. Ellsworth was a 44-year-old pilot and engineer who was also an admirer of Amundsen's previous expeditions. As the heir to a large inheritance, Ellsworth offered to put up the money to buy 2 new planes, both equipped with pontoons to land on water and ice, if Amundsen would bring him along on his Arctic expeditions. After coming to an agreement, Ellsworth and Amundsen met on the Norwegian island of Spitsbergen on the Svalbard archipelago, with 2 additional pilots and 2 mechanics in tow. The 6-man crew departed in the 2 aircrafts, the N-24 and N-25, making a 600-mile trip across the Arctic that would include an emergency landing of the N-24 and the N-25 crashing into the ice pack. All 6 crew members would have to return on the N-24, narrowly avoiding weighing down the plane and running out of fuel on their return journey. This first attempt at exploration of the Arctic from above convinced Amundsen that larger dirigible aircrafts would be better suited for this type of exploration. Hjalmar Reisar Larsen, the pilot who flew the N-25 for Amundsen, mentioned that the Italian government was selling a small airship called the N-1 for a relatively modest $100,000. Amundsen hoped to strike a deal for a new mission and telegraphed its designer, a young Italian colonel named Umberto Nobile. Together, Nobile, Amundsen, Ellsworth, and Reisar Larsen met in Oslo in 1925, mere weeks after the latter 3 completed their return trip on the N-25. After seeing the N-1 airship for themselves, Ellsworth agreed to purchase it and appointed Nobile as its pilot for a flight across the Arctic Ocean the following summer. The craft was renamed the N-1 Norge and was sailed from Rome to the crew's base camp in Kings Bay in Spitsbergen, where it arrived on May 7, 1926. 4 days later, on May 11th, they departed for the North Pole, stocked with supplies and manned with a crew 11 strong. The teams reached their destination the following day, and Amundsen, Ellsworth, and Nobile dropped their nation's flags, Norway, the United States, and Italy respectively, out of the aircraft and onto the ice below as a symbolic gesture. Amundsen, who had not been friendly with Nobile to this point, took note that the Italian flag Nobile had brought along was much larger than the other 2. He would later complain that with Nobile as pilot, the N-1 Norge had become, quote, a circus wagon in the sky. Amundsen came to despise the Italian and felt that Nobile was attempting to take credit for the journey's success for himself and for Italy, which by this time had fully descended into fascism under Mussolini. Amundsen officially retired after the Norge expedition, writing in his memoir published the following year that, quote, I cannot hope to find a possible field of achievement as important as that which lies behind me. Despite the success of the Norge mission, Nobile felt overshadowed by the more famous Amundsen and was determined to make another North Pole attempt with an Italian-only team. A second Nobile-designed airship, the Italia, designated N4, was built with funding provided by private backers in the city of Milan. It was almost identical to the N1 Norway, except slightly larger in gas capacity. While Nobile did not support Mussolini, and his relationship with the Italian government was strained, his reputation as a hero explorer amongst the public allowed him to continue his work without any direct threat. When Nobile announced his intentions of returning to the Arctic in the Italia, Mussolini's right-hand man, Italo Balb, Marshal of the Air Force, waved it off. "Let him go," he said, "for he cannot possibly come back to bother us anymore." The Italia was completed in 1928, and Nobile assembled a new crew of 15 additional men, including 3 physicists, a journalist, and several navigators, radio operators, and mechanics, as well as Nobile's fox terrier, Titina. Nobile planned 5 flights for the expedition, each exploring different areas around the North Pole. The first 2 flights were completed without incident, though poor weather conditions forced an early return the first time out. The third flight departed on May 23, 1928, following the Greenland coastline north and reaching the North Pole 19 hours later. As they had on the Norway, Nobile and the crew dropped an Italian flag onto the ice, this one delivered by Mussolini personally to Nobile before he left for Norway. They also dropped a flag of the city of Milan and a large oak cross bestowed on the crew by Pope Pius XI. Having indulged in a small ceremony upon reaching the pole, the crew prepared for their return journey. At this point, they had already been in the air for 22 hours, and they now fought against the strong headwind that had assisted their outbound journey. Nobile estimated it would take at least 40 hours to make it home. At 10:25 a.m. on May 25th, the Italia's crew noticed the ship was suddenly becoming tail-heavy. Nobile gave orders to bring the ship back up with elevators and emergency power, but to no avail. No one can definitively say what caused the Italia's rapid descent, though it seems the severe Arctic weather conditions certainly played a part. Earlier that morning, Nobile had made the decision to allow the aircraft to rise above the cloud layer into the sun, which would have caused the hydrogen in the balloon to heat, expand, and be released by an automatic valve system. When the airship descended again through the freezing clouds, it is theorized that the release valves were frozen open, or that the balloon had already lost too much hydrogen to stay aloft. Some have pointed to fatigue as a key factor in the questionable piloting. During the crash, the cabin separated from the balloon, and 9 men were left alive inside, including Nobile himself. There was only one confirmed fatality. The survivors made a small camp with scavenged supplies, and after a restless night's sleep, they set up the wireless and began sending distress calls. Their navigators calculated that the ice pack they had landed on was actually drifting the wrong direction, towards a remote region of Russia. The group spent another 3 nights at the camp, wondering what had happened to the 6 missing crew members who had disappeared with the balloon. Finally, with no sign of rescue, 2 of the crew members proposed sending the fittest men among them on a march across the ice in an attempt to find rescue. Nobile was firm in his belief that the wireless transmitter would eventually come through for them, but up until that point, their SOS signals had gone unanswered. Nobile decided to sleep on it, but he had his men prepare travel bags and sleds for the injured, so they would be ready to mobilize. The next morning, Filippo Zappi, one of the ship's navigators, climbed out of his tent to find a fully grown polar bear standing just a stone's throw from him, eyeing him curiously. He cautiously stepped back and whispered firmly to the rest of the camp, "There's a bear." Finn Malmgren, the Swedish physicist and meteorologist, emerged from his tent with a pistol they had salvaged from the survival kits. He crept towards the bear, while other crew members flanked him with additional weapons. Malmgren fired at the bear and hit his target. The men now had 400 pounds of additional fresh meat, mitigating the risk of starvation significantly. Zappi, however, along with his fellow navigator, Adalberto Mariano, still insisted that they needed to reach solid land as soon as they could, or their would-be rescuers may abandon their search. Finally, Nobile gave in, and the crew split into 2 groups. One group, made up of Malmgren, Zappi, and Mariano, would march across the ice in search of land, and one would stay behind with the wireless and continue to send signals. Both Nobile and Malmgren were pessimistic about either group's chances. A week passed before the group that had stayed behind received promising news. A news bulletin picked up by the wireless announced their SOS had been received by a Soviet outpost and was being relayed to the Italian government. 2 days later, this was confirmed by a Roman news bulletin directly, which announced the Italian officers aboard the Città di Milano, docked in Kings Bay, had been notified of their coordinates and were organizing a rescue mission. The group celebrated, and Nobile began to send detailed instructions as to how he suggested a rescue operation could be accomplished. Yet, aboard the Italian ship Città di Milano in Kings Bay, discussions had become tense. Officers aboard wanted to be very careful about how much information about the crash and the rescue attempts got out to the public, aware that it could reflect poorly on their country. Likewise, they could not come to an agreement on the best way to mount a rescue mission. Airplanes could be used to scout for survivors or to drop supplies, but likely would not be able to land on the ice or support the weight of several additional passengers. Meanwhile, other nearby countries like Norway and Sweden contributed their own rescue efforts, making a sort of Olympic Games out of which country would successfully find and rescue the crew first. Roald Amundsen himself was sitting down at a large banquet in Oslo when he received word that the crew of the Italia was in need of rescue, led by his old nemesis, Umberto Nobile. He stood up and announced to the rest of the room, quote, "I am ready to start instantly." He immediately boarded a train to Bergen. On June 17th, Amundsen and Reesar Larsen took search planes out to the general area where the Italia crew's distress signal had been pinpointed. Due to fog and bad weather, however, they did not spot the makeshift camp below and had to turn back. Finally, on June 20th, nearly a month after the Italia's original departure, an Italian search plane located Nobile and a faction of crew members who had stayed behind and were able to drop additional supplies down to them. Nobile sent a response to the Città di Milano at once, thanking them for the reinforcements, but urging a timely rescue as he believed the ice pack had started to thaw and disintegrate as the summer temperatures rose. Quote, "I think you should put yourself entirely in Amundsen's hands, as he is the only expert collaborating with you," Nobile's message read. But unbeknownst to Nobile, Amundsen himself had also disappeared. He and pilot Leif Dietrichson, along with a crew of 4 Frenchmen, had departed in a Latham 47-boat plane from Tromsø, Norway on June 18th, bound for Kings Bay. They never arrived. A fisherman who supposedly witnessed the Latham's departure recalled the plane moving unevenly as it disappeared into the fog. A wing float and gasoline tank from the Latham were eventually found near the Tromsø coast. Separate rescue efforts were made throughout the summer to locate Amundsen and his crew or the wreckage of the Latham. To this day, no remnants of either have ever been found. Amundsen likely died in the effort to save the life of a man he openly despised. Meanwhile, Nobile and his crew were still anxiously awaiting a rescue. On June 22nd, 2 Swedish planes dropped a message asking Nobile to scout an area where they could land an airplane fitted with skis. Nobile's men had already done the legwork of scouting such an area and went to work preparing it. The next day, the Swedish planes returned, and one of them successfully landed on the makeshift icy runway. The pilot trudged across the ice towards the camp. On arrival, he notified Nobile that he was under strict instructions to rescue the general first, and that they would return for the other survivors one by one throughout the rest of the day. Nobile reassured his men, picked up Titina, the dog which had miraculously survived the catastrophe, and was carried aboard the plane. He bid farewell to the ice floe he and his men had called home for the better part of a month, and was flown to a Swedish base camp, then eventually united with the Città di Milano. 8 crew members in total, including General Nobile, survived the ordeal. Finn Malmgren died when marching for help, though Zappi and Mariano, the other 2 men in his party, survived. Many believed that Zappi and Mariano abandoned Malmgren on the journey, while some believed they ate him out of desperation. The 6 men who disappeared along with the balloon were never found, and to this day, no trace of them or the balloon have ever been recovered. It remains a mystery as to what happened to the lost crew, the remains of the Airship Italia, and Roald Amundsen's plane. As new exploration of the Arctic shifts to under the ice, it is hoped the final fate of the airship and their failed rescue mission may one day be revealed. Until then, however, it seems that we will remain in the dark.